I was 20 years old when this happened. I'm 22 now, and even after 2 years, I still think about that night. Back then, I was in college and worked as a babysitter. During the week, I watched kids for one family, and on some weekends, I stayed with the children of a wealthy couple while they traveled. They had 2 kids, Ethan, who was 7, and Lily, who was 5. Their estate was enormous. A large house sat beside a pond, and across the water was a separate recreation building with a giant television, arcade machines, a pool table, and comfortable couches. An intercom system connected the recreation building to the main house, allowing anyone in either building to speak to the other. Friday evening was completely normal. I spent the day playing with the kids. Lily loved dolls and toy houses. Ethan preferred video games. After dinner, Lily went to bed at 7:30 and Ethan followed an hour later. Once they were asleep, I crossed the property to the recreation building. It was my favorite place to spend the evening because I could watch movies and talk on the phone without worrying about waking anyone. Around 10 o'clock, I got hungry and walked back to the main house. I unlocked the door using the keypad code and made myself a snack. The family always told me I could help myself to anything in the kitchen. As I waited for my food to heat up, I heard a faint creak somewhere deeper inside the house. I froze. The sound was subtle, the kind of noise old houses sometimes make at night. I listened for several seconds. Nothing. Feeling slightly uneasy, I grabbed my food and headed back outside. The cold autumn air hit me as I crossed the yard and returned to the recreation building. I sat on the couch, turned on a comedy movie, and started texting friends. A few minutes later, the intercom suddenly buzzed. The sound nearly made me jump out of my seat. I pressed the button. Hello? It was Lily. Her small voice trembled. She said she was scared because she kept hearing strange noises in her room. Trying to reassure her, I immediately headed back to the house. When I reached her bedroom, she was curled beneath her blanket. I tucked her in, checked the room, and told her everything was fine. Eventually, she smiled and relaxed. After making sure she felt safe, I left her room and headed downstairs. That was when I heard another sound. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the darkness. This time, it definitely didn't sound like the house settling. And for the first time that night, I felt truly uncomfortable. I stood completely still, staring into the dark hallway. The silence returned. After nearly a minute without another sound, I convinced myself I was imagining things. I locked the house and hurried back to the recreation building. The movie was still playing when I sat down again. I tried focusing on my phone and ignored the growing feeling that something wasn't right. Then the intercom buzzed again. My stomach dropped. I rushed over and answered. Lily? No response, only silence. I thought I could hear breathing, very faint breathing. I called both children's names several times, but nobody answered. Now I was genuinely frightened. I called my friend Megan and explained everything. She laughed at first, telling me I was probably scaring myself. While we talked, I stared through the large window facing the main house. That was when the hallway lights suddenly turned on. I immediately stopped speaking. A second later, a tall figure stepped into view. A grown man. He stood inside the house, visible through one of the windows. Even from that distance, I could tell he wasn't supposed to be there. And then he looked directly at me. I screamed. My phone slipped from my hand. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The man remained perfectly still, staring across the pond toward the recreation building. Then he disappeared from the window. That snapped me back to reality. I grabbed my phone and dialed emergency services. I was crying so hard the dispatcher struggled to understand me. I kept repeating the address and begging them to hurry. As the dispatcher asked questions, I remembered the intercom was still active. I shouted into it, "I've called the police. Leave the kids alone." No answer came back. Then the dispatcher asked a question that made my heart stop. "Are the children with you?" I whispered. "No." They were still inside the house, alone, with him. A second later, a terrified scream exploded through the intercom. It was Lily. I completely broke down. The dispatcher kept trying to calm me, but all I could think about was getting those children out safely. Then, Lily's voice came through again. She was crying. and she was calling my name. I ran to the intercom. "Lily, listen to me," she sobbed into the speaker. "There's a man in the house." "I know," I replied. "Go get Ethan right now. Then both of you come outside." The dispatcher immediately told me not to enter the house, but I knew the children wouldn't make it across the property alone. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. The cold night air burned my lungs as I sprinted across the yard. Every second felt dangerous. I expected the man to appear at any moment. When I reached the front entrance, the door suddenly opened. Lily rushed out first. Ethan was right behind her. Both were crying. I grabbed their hands and pulled them away from the house as fast as I could. None of us looked back. We ran straight to the recreation building. Once inside, I locked every door, switched off every light, and gathered the children beside me on the floor. The dispatcher remained on the line. Minutes felt like hours. The kids kept asking if the man would find us. I told them everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Then, finally, flashing lights appeared outside. Blue and red reflections filled the darkness beyond the windows. Police officers surrounded the property. The dispatcher informed me they had arrived. I nearly cried from relief. Officers escorted us outside. A female officer took the children to safety while another officer stayed with me and collected my statement. Meanwhile, more police searched the house and surrounding property. I watched from a patrol car as flashlight beams moved through windows and across the yard. The search continued for what felt like forever. Then suddenly several officers emerged from the house. And they weren't alone. They had found him. The man was handcuffed and being dragged toward a police vehicle. Even from a distance, I could see him looking around calmly, almost as if nothing had happened. When his eyes met mine, a chill ran through my body. I knew I would never forget his face. The children's parents were contacted immediately. They rushed home after receiving the call. No one stayed at the property that night. The kids went to stay with relatives while investigators processed the scene. I eventually gave my full statement and was allowed to leave. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that man standing in the hallway window. I kept hearing Lily's scream. I kept wondering what would have happened if she hadn't reached the intercom, or if police had arrived a few minutes later. In the days that followed, I learned more about the intruder. He had entered the property without permission and somehow made his way inside the house while the children slept. Investigators believed he had been watching the property for some time before choosing that night to enter. The thought made everything even more disturbing. The family pursued every possible charge against him. With the evidence police found, he was taken into custody and faced serious consequences. I was relieved, but the damage had already been done. For months afterward, I jumped whenever a phone rang unexpectedly. I checked locks repeatedly before going to bed. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase the memory of that night. The parents later asked if I would ever consider babysitting for them again. They were kind people, and none of what happened was their fault. But I respectfully declined. The house no longer felt like the beautiful place I once enjoyed. Whenever I thought about it, I remembered running across that dark yard, hearing a frightened child call my name through an intercom while a stranger moved through the house. That single night changed the way I viewed safety forever. And even now, years later, I still wonder how close we came to a much worse ending. A few weeks passed. Life slowly returned to normal, at least on the surface. I focused on college classes and picked up babysitting jobs with other families. I tried convincing myself that the nightmare was behind me. Then one evening, I received a call from Detective Harper, one of the officers who had worked the case. His voice sounded serious. He asked if I had time to come to the station. My stomach immediately tightened. When I arrived, he sat me down in a small interview room. He explained that investigators had learned more about the man. His name was Victor Kane. He had no connection to the family, no employment history with them, no relatives connected to them, nothing. Yet they discovered something deeply disturbing. For nearly 3 months, Victor had been secretly visiting the property. Trail cameras from neighboring landowners had captured him multiple times walking through nearby woods. Sometimes during the day, sometimes in the middle of the night. The detective slid several photographs across the table. I instantly recognized the man. My blood ran cold. One photograph showed him standing near the pond. Another showed him hiding behind trees less than 50 yards from the house. Then I saw the worst image. Victor was standing beside the recreation building. The photograph had been taken nearly 6 weeks before the night he entered the house. 6 weeks. That meant he had likely seen me before I ever saw him. The detective continued. Victor never stole anything, never damaged anything, never attempted to sell information about the family. According to investigators, he seemed obsessed with watching people, studying them, learning routines. The family wasn't his first target either. Several similar incidents in neighboring counties were now being connected to him. Homes, cabins, vacation properties, places where families stayed. The detective couldn't tell me everything because the investigation was ongoing. But before I left, he gave me one piece of advice. Be careful for a while. I asked him why. He paused. Then he said something that haunted me for months. Because you're the person who got him caught. After that conversation, I became paranoid. Every sound outside my apartment made me nervous. Every unknown number that called my phone made my heart race. I checked door locks repeatedly before bed. One rainy evening, about 2 months later, I was studying alone in my apartment. The rain tapped against the windows. The room felt unusually quiet. Then my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I ignored it. A minute later, it rang again. Same number. I declined the call. Then another call came. And another. And another. 5 calls within 10 minutes. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. My hands shook as I pressed play. At first, there was only static, then breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, nothing else. The message ended. I stared at the screen. Someone had intentionally recorded that. I immediately called the detective. He took it seriously enough to have the number traced. A few days later, he contacted me again. The number had been purchased using fake identification, no useful leads. But the detective believed the call was probably someone trying to scare me rather than Victor himself. Probably. That word didn't make me feel much better. For weeks afterward, I slept with lights on. The breathing from that voicemail kept replaying in my head, and every time I thought I was finally moving on, something reminded me of that night at the mansion. Spring arrived. Things finally started improving. The calls stopped. My anxiety slowly faded. Then I received an unexpected message from the children's mother. She wanted to meet for coffee. At first, I wasn't sure why, but I agreed. When we met, she looked exhausted. She thanked me again for saving her children. Then she told me something I had never heard before. After police arrested Victor, investigators searched a storage unit connected to him. Inside, they found notebooks, dozens of notebooks. Most were filled with observations about people, schedules, descriptions, addresses, routines. The mother looked down at her coffee. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. One notebook was dedicated entirely to their family. Page after page, months of notes, descriptions of who entered the house, when lights turned on, when lights turned off, which windows remained open, when the parents traveled. Everything. Even worse, there were notes about me, the dates I arrived, the times I crossed the property, the movies I watched in the recreation building, the clothes I wore. I couldn't speak. The realization felt unreal. Someone had been watching me for months without my knowledge. The mother explained that police believed Victor's obsession wasn't with the family. It was with whoever happened to be there, whoever caught his attention. That thought terrified me more than anything else, because it meant there had never been a reason, no motive, no plan anyone could understand, just obsession. And that made him unpredictable. A year later, the trial finally began. I was called to testify. Walking into the courtroom was harder than I expected. The moment I entered, I saw him sitting at the defense table. Victor looked different, older, thinner, but his eyes were exactly the same, cold, empty, watching. During my testimony, I explained everything that happened that night. The intercom, the window, the scream, the children, the police arrival, every detail. Victor never looked away from me, not once. When it was over, I stepped down and left the courtroom. Weeks later, the verdict came. Guilty, on every major charge. The sentence ensured he would spend many years behind bars. The children's family finally found some peace. So did I. At least mostly. But even now, years later, there are moments when the memory returns. Sometimes when I hear an unexpected noise at night. Sometimes when I see a light turn on in an empty house. Sometimes when a phone rings from an unknown number. And every now and then, I remember standing in that recreation building, looking across a dark pond toward a glowing mansion, seeing a stranger staring back at me through a window, knowing 2 children were trapped inside, knowing I had to run toward the danger, and realizing that some nightmares don't end when the police arrive. Some stay with you forever. Years passed, but the shadow of that night never fully left me. I moved apartments, changed jobs, and tried to build a life that felt normal. Still, every time I heard about home intrusions or read news stories about people being watched, a chill ran down my spine. Then, one late autumn evening, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid. It was taken from a distance and showed my old college campus, the very place where I had lived and babysat at that mansion. My heart raced. I flipped the photo over. Written in messy handwriting was a single word: watching. I froze. Every instinct screamed to call the police, but the handwriting seemed old, almost like it had been copied from somewhere. Detective Harper had long retired from the case, and there was nothing more I could report. The photo had no identifying markers beyond the campus buildings. That night, I sat awake, flashlight beside my bed, checking every window and every lock. Reggie, my old beagle who had long since passed, would have been proud of my vigilance. Sleep eventually came, but it was uneasy. For the first time, I understood that some people never stop observing, and some memories never fade completely. That single image reminded me, fear doesn't always follow logic. Sometimes, it's the unknown that terrifies you most. Months later, I returned to the mansion for a quiet college reunion. The family had sold the property to a new owner who had no idea about the past. Walking up the path, I felt the weight of my own memories. The pond, the pool house, and the large mansion all seemed serene in the soft sunlight, completely unaware of the terror that had once unfolded there. I stopped at the recreation building, now stripped of its old furnishings, and looked out the window toward the main house. For a moment, I imagined seeing him again. But there was nothing, just a gentle breeze moving across the pond. I realized that the real horror wasn't in the house itself. It was the memory, the lingering fear, the knowledge that someone could invade the safety of a home at any moment. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had faced the nightmare, helped the children, and survived. Victor Kane's shadow would always be a part of my story, but it no longer controlled me. The mansion, the pond, and even the terrifying intercom were just parts of a chapter that had shaped me. I drove away, knowing that life, though unpredictable and sometimes horrifying, could still be lived, and that survival, courage, and quick thinking could make all the difference. Some nightmares follow you forever, but courage teaches you to keep walking anyway.